Okay, hello, welcome everyone. It's really good to have everyone here. We're going to start right away. We kind of run a few minutes late already, but it's such a pleasure to have our two guest speakers, Professor Owen Seda, Professor Samuel Ravengai here. We don't anticipate the evening being longer than 90 minutes, so about an hour and a half. So it's going to start with a short introduction from myself. I don't anticipate the introduction taking more than 10 minutes. And then we'll introduce our guests and then hear from them. And once they finish their talk, so Samuel is going to speak first. And once we've heard from Samuel, we're going to hear from Owen. And then we'll open it up for questions. If you've got questions, I will encourage you while they are speaking to post those questions in the chat. And then we'll pose those questions to them as soon as it is the question and answer time. But before we start, just some few tips to make sure we get the best experience, all of us today. Please make sure your microphone is muted. Also, if you can, go to a place where you are not distracted by other people so you can focus and listen to what's being said and participate in and engage with the conversations. Like I said already, please submit your questions in the chat during the presentation so we can pick that up after the presentations. Just to say that this event is being recorded. It's also streamed live onto our YouTube platform. Please, if you do not want to be recorded, can I please suggest that you make sure your video is turned off so that we do not capture you in the recording. So just a little bit about the African Theatre Association. My name is Kene Iguano. I'm the president of African Theatre Association, AfTA. I'm also the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries at Middlesex University in London. The African Theatre Association, the three pillars on which African Theatre Association is built is identity, community, and belonging. So it was started as an international membership organization that is open to scholars and practitioners of African theatre and performance, irrespective of their race or wherever in the world they are located. The AfTA started in 2006, and Professor Sito Kabwe was the first president of the association. The mission of the association is to help define and shape African theatre scholarship and pedagogy by liberating them from a bondage to non-African discursive framework. Those of you who are Africanist scholars will recognize this. So that was really at the heart of why the African Theatre was started in 2006. One of the main vehicles for driving that mission of the association is our journal, the African Performance Review. The African Performance Review is undergoing some changes currently. So we are moving to make it an online journal that can be accessed online. We'll still retain a limited print version of the journal, but the idea is that we can have an open access journal that can be accessed everywhere. It's a peer-reviewed journal. It's published twice a year, and is dedicated to publishing and high-quality research and information on African theatre and performance, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. And the first issue of the journal was published in 2007, so a year after the founding of the association, with a special issue on women in African theatre and performance. So AfTA exists to facilitate the exploration and communication of African theatre and performance traditions, processes, and practices through its conferences, events, and publications. So we facilitate the advancement of education in the study and practice of African theatre and performance. And these are some of the ways we do it. We provide regular forum for scholarly debates and for practitioners to meet and exchange ideas as well, such as what we are doing today. Publication is another key vehicle for AfTA to do this work. And we want to engage with the wider public, so beyond just academics and practitioners, to the wider public. AfTA is governed by constitutions, just like most other associations, and the governance lies with the executive board, of which I'm the president and chair of the trustee. So it's a registered charity in the United Kingdom. And the General Assembly, of course, our most important decision-making organ. Membership is open to every academic or researcher or student who is interested in African theater practice or scholarship. And I use the term Africanist to describe those people. So again, just to emphasize, it's not about race or country of origin or of residence, if it is about dedicated interest to Africanist studies. So we've got 4 categories of membership, as you can see, and our membership year runs from January to December. We've got a general membership, which again, recognizing the unequal distribution of wealth around the world, we make sure that for members who are resident in Global North, we pay £60 per annum. And for our members in the Global South, particularly Africa and the Caribbean, is £30. And of course, student membership also reflects that distinction between Global North and Global South. These are the members of the current executive, and I'm not going to read the names, but these are the members. And again, you find this information on our website. I'm going to quickly run through this. I'm not going to spend time with this, but just to kind of show you some of the things we've done over the years. In 2006, when AfTA was started, we started with an inaugural symposium, which looked at women in African theatre and performance, and that was hosted by Goldsmiths University of London. And then we had the 2007, but you see that in 2008, we didn't have a conference. As a young association still trying to get to grips, it wasn't possible to have a conference then, but we came back in 2009 and all the way. One of the key things about AfTA conferences, just to say this, is that from the very beginning, AfTA set out to make sure that conferences revolve between the Global North and the continent. And Africa. So we tend to hold our conferences either in the UK, America, or elsewhere, and then back to Africa and the Caribbean. So you can see we've been to Uganda, we've been to South Africa, we've been to Ghana, we've been to Nigeria, we've been to Barbados, and we've been to Angola. And this year we're going to Berlin. And these are some of the themes of the conferences. And you can see that in 2020, because of the global pandemic, we postponed that conference, and that's a conference that is happening this year in Germany. And most of you, I believe, would have submitted abstracts for that. So our first inaugural symposium of our Symposium of Development in African Theatre and Performance was held last year. And we had, it was held over 2 days. So we had Professor Sandra Richards, Crystal Truscott, and Professor Cathy Perkins on the first day. And on the second day, we had Dr. Oladipo Agboluaje in conversation with Dr. Shola Adeyemi. So I've mentioned this already. So in just about 2 weeks' time, we have our 2021 International Conference, Aging, Old Age, and Disability in African Theatre and Performance, African and African Diaspora Performance, Film, and Festivals. And our 2 keynote speakers are Dr. Yves Hutchinson and Professor Samuel Kasule. And if you haven't submitted an abstract, I hope you'll still be able to make it. Attendance this year, we're waiving the registration fee, obviously because of COVID, but the requirement to attend this year is that you'll be a member of AfTA, which is a lot cheaper than paying a registration for a conference, and I can assure you. So please get on our website and find out how to pay for membership so that you can join us for the conference in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if the chair is here. Is Tosin on the call?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so over to Tosi to please introduce our guests. Tosi Tume is a member of the AfTA executive, and I'm going to give her the floor to introduce our guests.
Hello, everyone. So for today, we have 2 speakers, Professor Samuel Ravengai and Professor Owen Seda. The first speaker is Samuel Ravengai. He is an associate professor of theater and performance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He holds a PhD and MA in theater and performance from the University of Cape Town. He is interested in the interconnection of race, nation, empire, migration, and ethnicity with cultural production. He is currently involved in a research project called Afro-Sinology, which seeks to decolonize theater and propound a theory on African and diasporic aesthetics based on their practice across several years. Our second speaker, Owen Seda, is an associate professor and acting head of the Department of Performing Arts at the Tshwane University of Technology in Pretoria, South Africa. He has taught at the University of Zimbabwe, Africa University, the University of Botswana, and the University of Pretoria. And he has been a Commonwealth scholar and a Fulbright scholar in residence in the Department of Theater and New Dance, California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. He has also published 3 edited books and published over 50 international journal articles and book chapters in publications such as Drama Research, the English Academy Review, Commonwealth Youth and Development, Theater Topics, Journal of Literary Studies, Matatu, Zambexia, National Australian Drama in Education, South African Journal of African Languages and Literature, and Research in Drama Education, among others. So ladies and gentlemen, shall we have Professor Samuel Ravengai, our first speaker? Thank you.
Samuel, you're muted.
Thank you, Tosim. It's really a pleasure to be speaking to colleagues across the globe this evening. And thank you, Tosim, for your generosity in terms of introducing us to our colleagues who are engaging with us virtually. As I do this, allow me to share my screen so I can begin to engage with the work that myself and Owen have been working on over the last couple of years. I must go to slideshow. Okay, there we go. All right, colleagues, the book that we've been working on over the last 3 years is entitled Theater from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. It's subtitled Hegemony, Identity, and a Contested Postcolony. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term Rhodesia, it is the colonial name for the new country, Zimbabwe. I think that name was dropped in 1980 on the 18th of April when Zimbabwe gained independence from Great Britain. And that's the context. And I'm gonna move on to the next slide, which is essentially depicting how the book is going to be looking like. Its release date is now confirmed. It's the 23rd of July, 2021. It has those beautiful pictures of 2 wonderful performers that I directed a couple of years ago. The play is written or was written by Dambudzo Marechera. I was the director of the show. And the designs were made by my design students at the Witwatersrand University, a Department of Theatre and Performance. If you want more details about ourselves, over and above what our colleague Tonsi has said, you have a look at the left side of the screen, which is what the book is talking about, and our backgrounds in terms of research and so on. So that's how the book is going to be looking like. It's the series editors for the book were Ellen Aston and Brian Singleton, at one time the president of the International Theatre Federation. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is framing this discussion. The book essentially has two parts. Part one is entitled From Colonial to Decolonial Theater, Contested Forms, and it is going to form the main burden of my discussion this evening. It also comprises part two, The Politics of Representation, which Professor Owen Seda will be speaking to this evening. And I must hasten to say that the two of us were colleagues at the University of Zimbabwe. Myself from 2000, Owen Seda a couple of years before 2000. And we both left between 2008 and 9 for work and studies at different universities. And this work, which is a theater from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, is our first collaboration, and we hope to do more of these co-writings and editorships in future. Perhaps the most interesting question or pertinent question that may be asked is, why this book? Why this collection? And we are motivated for the writing of this book by indicating the Euro exclusivity, or what Ali Mazuri calls Euro exclusivity, of the other written works on Zimbabwe theater and performance. And let me hasten to say that to date, 8 books have been written on Zimbabwean theater, or some aspects of it. If you can see my screen, one in 1968 by Charles Taylor, George Jackson in 1974, Robert Carey in 1975, Rangazi Nyemba, Plasto, Robert Kavanagh, Del Bam, and Martin Roma. What I need to say, which exemplifies Euro exclusivity, is the first 3 books. They have no place for African theater whatsoever, and they are written from a colonialist perspective. In other words, there is the invisibility of the majority of people who occupied the territory of Rhodesia, as Zimbabwe was then called, in the colonial period. And we feel that by writing this book, we are turning invisibility into visibility by focusing our attention on the majority of theater makers in Zimbabwe who've been creating work since colonial times up to this moment. We have not been paid attention to by the Eurocentric scholarship. The last 5 books have been written by people not originally from Zimbabwe, but Europeans, except from one scholar who is Rangazi Nyemba. It's quite a dated one, written in 1986. So again, while we appreciate the work that our colleagues have done in terms of advancing knowledge, in the case of Dale Balaam, Plasto, Robert Kavanagh, and Martin Roma, again, we think that it is important to really be focusing on a variety of African voices and Africanist voices to the theorization and understanding of Zimbabwean theater and performance. And this is why we endeavored to undertake this project, which will be in the public domain from the 23rd of July, 2021. Again, why the book? We intend to decolonize the theater, or theater and performance. Our understanding is that the majority of the books that I've listed above tend to speak to or critique African theater from a particular privileged point of view, but we intend to turn the gaze on African theater makers and how do we wish to decolonize African theater. Number one, by eliminating the invisibility which is prevalent in the invisibility of African theater makers, which is prevalent in Eurocentric criticism. We also understand that the scholars who approach writing of African theater from that perspective have an inner eye, which is the domain of theory and the domain of ideology, which tends to overrule the evidence of the senses. They may have a sense of what is happening in Zimbabwe in terms of theater and performance, but because of the ideological construction of the writer, they may choose not to see what is evident before their senses and write otherwise. There's also the tendency for those who are interested, or for those who write on African theater, to see that black art or African theater from a particular perspective, which denies the counter-hegemonic impulses that are present in the work. And what we think our book is demonstrating is the fact that for that work that has been covered, we tend to then look at how African theater makers were responding to the larger colonial, or what I've called Rhodesian discourse, in order to create new theater that responds to that. We also believe that there was the denial of black personhood, and this is the domain of stereotypes from the 13 plays that were written during Rhodesian time by colonial subjects, and also those who have tried to critique the work up to this particular moment. There is the tendency, and I'm speaking in general terms here, of stereotyping those who are partaking in that theater making process, or the characters that are created therefore in that work. So when we are writing, or when we were writing this work, we were trying to correct those kinds of perspectives. We also, by writing this book, are proposing new training methods in performance. You will see that one of the chapters is dedicated to Amakosi theater and their training curriculum. And we hope that the universities will be interested in seeing how some of the alternative theater practitioners are creating new theories and new practices that may be relevant in the teaching of the curriculum in the classroom, as far as acting and or performance is concerned. And lastly, we hope to apply, or we applied all theories in order to generate new theories. And I think Tonsi was generous enough to indicate that I'm working on a project that I'm calling Afro-Sinology, which is looking at the work that has been happening in the continent of Africa and proposing a theory that comes from that. The underlying belief is that all theory comes from practice, and it comes back to guide practice. So if Africans have been developing and creating work over a long period of time, where is the theory that speaks to that practice? And this is what the book in part tries to do, and further research in my own work around Afro-Sinology will try to demonstrate. I now want to contextualize the book by saying that this is a collection that surveys theater produced in Zimbabwe from the last days of colonialism in the 1970s up to 2009, when the country's post-independence political and economic crisis started to slow down around around 2009. And the crisis had begun in November 1997, but started slowing down around that period. After SADC brokered government of national unity that brought together the then ruling ZANU-PF party under the late Robert Mugabe and its chief post-independence political adversary, the Movement of Democratic Change, MDC, under the late Morgan Tsvangirai. We used the establishment of the GNU of 2009 as a cutoff point for this collection. But of course, as with any declared demarcation lines, there's always the problem of, does the book end there? You will notice that some of the chapters, maybe one or two I can count, will go beyond 2009 and cover the period just after 2009 up to about 2013. But specifically speaking, the majority of the chapters capture that period of the late 1970s up to 2009. For those of you who may not be familiar with Zimbabwe, I'm going to just say a few things in passing about the country and how these major landmark historical events influenced the development of theater in Zimbabwe, or actually how theater responded to those moments in terms of speaking back to those scenarios. 1890, the country was colonized by Great Britain through a chartered company called the British South African Company, owned by Cecil John Rhodes. 1922 referendum, most people don't know this. Zimbabwe would have been the 5th province of South Africa, but those who qualified to vote at that particular time, mainly the white colonials, refused to join the Union of South Africa, which had been formed in 1910 to bring together the Cape Colony, Natal Colony, the Orange Free State, and Transvaal. And then a responsible government was established in 1923. 1953, 1963, there was the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, sometimes called the Central African Federation, CAF. 1964, the Rhodesia Front, this was a white party, came to power with Ian Smith at the helm of that process, that political process. And in 1965, he declared unilaterally independence of Rhodesia from the United Kingdom. In other words, the Queen would not sign bills into law, and he had to elect a governor resident in Rhodesia, as Zimbabwe was then called, who would then sign those bills into law. And the response to that process was a protracted liberation struggle, one of the bloodiest and longest ones, starting from 1966 up to 1979, when the ceasefire was declared. And 1970, a constitutional amendment proclaimed Rhodesia a republic. And then 1979, Ian Douglas Smith tried to do an internal settlement by running elections, and the country was renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia. But however, the United Nations and most of the sponsors of that political project did not recognize the new political dispensation, which led to the intensification of the liberation war, leading to the December 1979 ceasefire, and of course, independence 1980 on the 18th of April. And just after that, there was an unfortunate event which Owen is going to speak to, which is the 1983-1987 civil war, particularly in the Midlands and Matabeleland provinces. And of course, our cutoff period, which is 1998-2008, where there was a political and economic crisis of levels comparable to the Weimar Republic of Germany. Inflation skyrocketing to trillions in terms of percentage. And I think our chapters do cover the levels or the magnitude of the crisis during that period. Perhaps some of you may ask, is the crisis over? It slowed down, as I mentioned, at the formation of the Government of National Unity. And we believe that Zimbabwe is on the mend. I think in the Southern African region, it is the only country that is registering a protracted growth in terms of GDP to the tune of 3.9% in the first quarter. And we expect the GDP to grow by 7.1 by the end of the year. So we assume that things are getting better, although we're not yet there. And therefore the crisis is a thing of the past. Colleagues, I now want to connect the history and the performance as I signposted at the beginning. How did theater respond or intervene to those political scenarios that unfolded during the colonial period and of course after independence? So the collection suggests that performance not only intervenes, but also offers alternative insights into the historical, socio-economic, political trajectories and narratives of its time. So the collection not only focuses on the history of performance cultures in colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe, but it also extends its critical gaze to the history of political ideas that gave rise to cultural contestations in the field of theater and performance. Given this historical context, we now want to establish the intersection of these colonial forces with the Zimbabwean theater and performance. And the best way to do that is to give you a glimpse of how the chapters are looking like, particularly in part one that I'm covering. So in terms of response to those political scenarios, look at chapter 2, which is colonial Zimbabwean theater, cultural production and the interplay with Rhodesian power and discourse. I am going to speak slightly after this discussion about how that first chapter responds to that history. And then chapter 3, negotiating whitehood, identity resistance in Rhodesia between 1950 and 1980. Chapter 4, transformative complexity of found objects in devised Zimbabwean theater. Chapter 5, and this is what I was talking about, Amakosi theater training between 1980 and 2000, an exercise in syncretism. And then chapter 6, contestation in post-colonial drama, residual and emergent consciousness in Zimbabwean theater after independence, and NTO on that by one of the co-editors, who is Owen Seda. And then finally, in this part 1, there is creating counter-public spheres, performance in Zimbabwe between the influence of Mugabe and NGOs by Julius Heineke. So let me try to capture just in brief as the discussion or as a presentation such as this can only be able to do without having to speak about the whole book. So chapter 2, remember I said colonization took place 1890. Chapter 2 really goes into the mechanics of colonial discourse, which I refer, and I'm the author to that chapter. That's why I'm using the personal pronoun I refer to as Rhodesian discourse. So Rhodesian discourse provided strictures to cultural production and restricted what was written or what was to be written or what was to be performed. And for this reason, a certain type of theater emerged that was written by both white and black playwrights, which towed the line of non-resistance to colonial presence. Actually, the 13 plays that I referred earlier on, written by white colonial subjects, were all depicting stereotypical images of black people as those who were capable of violence without provocation, or those who acted without purpose or aim. In other words, they were lacking urgency, they simply revolted. So the entire 13 plays were analyzed by Jane Plasto, in a book, I think 1996 book, and she comes to that conclusion that they were trying to toe the line of Rhodesian discourse. Now, for those who tried to write during the colonial period, they were not permitted to include white characters. In other words, they could not exercise their agency as black people to write about the other. They could write about themselves, but within the confines of what Rhodesian discourse could provide. Now, the question is, was this an absolute discourse where everybody respected and behaved according to the strictures that were provided by this particular narrative? The question, of course, that we deal with in that chapter is no, as other chapters will also demonstrate. There were particular ways in which black people, black theater or African theater makers were responding to that by saying, we will not do this. Walter Mparutsa being a perfect example. I think he was translating Shona and Ndebele novels into plays and then exercising his agency to revolt against the system. And that led to his expulsion from the Rhodesia Literature Bureau for his political aims. I think he was arrested together with Dominic Canavente in the 60s for those political activities. I'm just giving you an example of how theater makers resisted colonial discourse. Now, from there, we go to chapter 3 and 4. Now, you will notice that since I've argued that a discourse is not absolute, there was a certain section of white colonial subjects, nowadays called liberals, who decided not to toe the line by writing plays and also working with black people in order to create a kind of theater that was, or that provided a field of counter-discursive strategies to the dominant discourse. So sections of white theater makers defied Rhodesian discourse, and this is what is demonstrated in chapter 3. That is co-authored by myself and a colleague called Kelvin Chukonzo, and we demonstrate that. In other words, we are not saying all white people during colonial times were bad or respected that discourse, but there was a certain section that spoke back to that discourse by creating a counter-discursive strategy in their plays. And chapter 3 demonstrates that kind of narrative. And then chapter 4 begins to dwell on the issue of decolonizing theater. And what is refreshing about Mulenga and Shwandikwa in their discussion of decolonization of African theater is that there is no way we can valorize the performing body as the major identity feature of African theater without incorporating issues of or elements of design in that body. And what the chapter is trying to argue for is that most scholars who have written on decolonizing African theater tend to valorize the performing body and say African theater does this, but they tend to forget the importance of props and costumes in order to enhance that body in projecting whatever it is trying to do. And chapter 4 tries to do that. 5 and 6, Amakosi training theater, and this is the domain of my theory that I am propounding, which is Afro-sinology. Svanda and Yule argued that Amakosi created a syncretic blend of what was being offered by the Zimbabwe Association of Community Theatre and also the National Theatre Organization. The latter was dominated by white people, whilst the former was dominated by black people, in specific Ngugi wa Miri from Kenya. And what the chapter is demonstrating is that Contemplanga did not feel compelled to adopt only one position, but he used his own personal agency as a theater maker to choose what he wanted. And then he created a new training mode in terms of performance, characterized by song, dance, sport, martial arts, dialogue, visual dramaturgy, and all of this anchored within Ndebele indigenous text matrix. And this is what the authors there are trying to argue. And chapter 6, what is interesting about this is Seda's awareness of colonial discourse, which underpinned practical choices made by the National Theatre Organization. Seda observes how the counter-colonial narrative espoused by this organization influenced artistic choices made by the groups affiliated to it. So he further observes that neither the colonial discourse nor counter-colonial discourse was an absolute philosophy, an issue that we also try to make right at the beginning of the book is emphasized in this particular chapter. So I feel a little bit nervous to talk about Owen this chapter while he's listening to me. And I'm going to jump to the last one before I hand over to him, which is chapter 7, written by Julius Heneke. Julius analyzes two theater spaces in Zimbabwe, which is basically Amakosi Township Theater and of course rooftop promotions. I think when I checked well in the chat, Debs Guja might be one of our audience members. He's listening to what I'm talking about. So there in chapter 7, Julius Heneke is talking to what these two spaces have provided in the context of Zimbabwe. What he seems to be arguing for is that the two spaces provided a space arena that has been able to circumvent the state's overweening attitude towards the dissent. And what he's referring to here is the period beginning from 1997, 1998 up to 2008, which is the cutoff point for the production. When the crisis emerged, there was a concentration or a mobilization around the third Chimurenga and what historians have called the patriotic history narrative, where everybody who was anti-state was considered to be out of tune, an enemy or a sellout. And what the two spaces, Amakosi and the Theatre in the Park, were able to do was to offer a public sphere where opposition to the patriotic discourse narrative could be offered in that particular space. And if you want to know more about these chapters, please do buy the book as soon as it is out on the 23rd of July, 2021. This is the end of part one, and I'm happy to hand over to my colleague, co-editor, Professor Owen Seda. Over to you as I stop my slide sharing. There we go. Hope I'm going to get it right. What else do I do, Ken? Do I go escape? And escape. Okay, great. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much, my brother Sam, for a very compendious and lucid account on the theory that frames our discourse and what our contributors say in the text. My task is a relatively simple one. I think Sam has said, has framed the overarching thinking behind what the book talks about in total. But my task is to refer to aspects or elements of representation as they appear in the various contributions within the book. There's about 5 chapters that constitute the second part of the book, and the second part goes under the title, "The Politics of," or rather the subtitle, "The Politics of Representation in Zimbabwean Theatre." So, as I said earlier on, there are part two has these 5 chapters, and it focuses on the politics of representation in post-independent Zimbabwean theatre against the background of the ideological framework which Sam so clearly outlined in his earlier deposition. So all the chapters in this part or in this section proceed from the central notion that the politics and issues of representation, as well as the controversies that often attend to these in countries such as Zimbabwe, whose history was marked by fierce battles over racial, cultural, and political control, tend to be very, very pronounced and protracted. Wherever countries or entities or societies have faced or fought fierce battles which revolve around issues of race, culture, and political control, then matters of representation also become very, very protracted and interesting to pursue and navigate. So all the 5 chapters that are in part 2 of the book grapple with the notion of representation in Zimbabwean theatre, but interestingly enough, each one in its own very peculiar and interesting way. So all the chapters do look at the question of representation, but the different contributors adopt approach the matter of representation from a unique and interesting perspective in their own right. The issues that fascinate the contributors is that they want to look at how protest and popular forms of theatre in Zimbabwe came to represent matters or focuses as diverse as disability, ethnic and Ndebele identities, as well as the larger Zimbabwean political and economic crisis as it set forth at the beginning of the new millennium. So all these chapters look at diverse issues in terms of the post-independence Zimbabwean experience, from issues of what does it mean to be disabled, what does it mean to be subaltern, what does it mean to belong to the country's ethnic national identities, such as the Venda, the Ndebele, and the Shangana, among others, and also the way that ordinary people experienced the political and economic crisis which set forth, particularly after 1997, following developments which I'll outline later on as I go on with my presentation. So in themselves, all the contributions in part 2, which focuses on issues of representation, present some pretty varied and disparate positions on the country's politics of representation in ways that, interestingly enough, also actually enable us or help us as readers and listeners to understand the complex nature of the dynamics of Zimbabwean history, theatre, and society, and how it all impinged on matters of identity and how those identities were represented in different social and artistic contexts. In fact, one could actually say, or one day say that the section is rendered even the more fascinating if one considers the fact that the very notion of representation itself, which is what anchors part 2 of the book, as it is theorized by eminent scholars such as Stuart Hall, among others, is a very, very interesting and perhaps in a manner of speaking, also a largely contested one, in the sense that what a lot of people do ask, what is representation? And the notion of representation itself is not something that scholars across the world are necessarily agreed in terms of putting a finger on exactly what representation is all about. But if one quotes Stuart Hall, who has written quite extensively on the concept, he says that it's an essential part of the way in which meaning is produced and exchanged through the use of language, signs, and images, all of which come to represent things as we perceive them in reality. So what then becomes very interesting, issuing from this specific definition from Stuart Hall, is that when you look at the practice of post-independent Zimbabwean theatre, you get a sense, if, for instance, if one harks back to some of what Samuel said earlier on in his presentation, when you look at the way in which power was contested through representation in Zimbabwean theatre, you get to realize that much as those who wield power, for instance, if I refer back to Sam's presentation once again, the Rhodesian discourse, they tended to choose to represent reality in certain specific and self-serving ways. Yet, interestingly also, when you look at the practice of theatre after 1997, or perhaps even after the onset of independence in 1980, what you get to realize is that gradually, those without power also came to use similar and other systems of representation to create counter-narratives that sought to challenge the dominant meta-narratives. So when you look at the history of Zimbabwe from 1997 up to 2008 and beyond, it became very easy and quite clear that certain discourses were propagated by those who wielded state power, while those who existed at the margins, either as minority groups or other forms of representation, also used also adopted theatre as a platform to propagate counter-narratives which sought to challenge the hegemony of the post-independence Zimbabwean state. So a particularly fascinating account on issues of representation, which comes in part 2 of the book, is presented by Chinanu, Chivandikwa, and myself as a co-writer, when they describe and analyze a group of university students based at the University of Zimbabwe. They put together a group of young university students, some with disabilities, physical disabilities, and some living with the condition of albinism, working and performing together with abled students, if one would like to put it that way. And they used workshop theatre and performance to disrupt certain pedestrian meanings and approaches that are often ascribed to people living with the condition of either physical disability or albinism. So once again, theatre was used to interrogate matters of identity through representation for people living with such conditions as physical disability as well as albinism. And in this chapter, the writers come to the conclusion that performance can actually be used or can be harnessed to disrupt certain ableist prejudices that people in society often arrogate towards, or with which people in society often approach people that live with disabilities. Then, while Stuart Hall identifies 3 theories or approaches to the notion of representation, namely the reflective, the intentional, as well as the constructionist, what is interesting in part 2 of the book or the collection is that most of the contributors in this part of the book choose to deploy the constructionist approach to representation, which suggests that systems and objects do not inherently have meaning, but rather that meaning is actually a socially constructed concept which people bring to a phenomena or lived reality on the basis of their own personal upbringing and perceptions and prejudices. So in other words, meaning is something that is actually socially constructed and not necessarily embedded in systems, so much so that the various systems of representation that we know are just a corpus among which theater also belongs. So the chapters in the second part of the collection focus on the politics of representation in terms of disability and albinism, as I said earlier on, and Ndebele identities, because the Ndebele, following certain experiences which occurred after independence, gradually began to see themselves as a marginalized section of Zimbabwean, of the Zimbabwean nation state. So too the Venda and the Shangani, who were already minority cultural identities and national groups, including subaltern citizens, as well as people in the very lowest social classes of the country following the advent of independence. So all the chapters focus on how these different groups are represented using the agency of the theater form. So all the contributors seem to be united by the perception of Zimbabwean theater as a veritable site for the construction of meanings that seemed to favor the agency of the country's otherwise marginalized social groups. So it doesn't matter that one was Ndebele or Shangan or subaltern or poor, unemployed and living in the townships and so on and so forth, but people who practice theater seemed to have adopted the theater form as a way in which to challenge the dominance of the hegemonic groups. So the authors that appear in part 2 of our book view theater practitioners as well as the country's generality of citizens as people who not only lived at the periphery of society, but some kind of transgressive marginalities who were still able to challenge the hegemony of the central state. In all the chapters that are represented in part 2 of the group, marginalized groups are presented as having the capacity to transgress the hegemony of dominant identities and dominant narratives that were propagated by the state and its overweening political system through the agents of such things as protest theater, if one looks at Kelvin Chikonzo's chapter, and also panic theater, if one looks at Joy Rawson's chapter, and including popular theater, if one looks at Mandla Mpofu and Cletus Moyo's chapter. So in all these instances, the marginalized used the theater as a vehicle through which to challenge the dominance of the country's hegemonic forces. Two things, however, seem to have framed the politics of representation in post-independent Zimbabwe, particularly after 1997, and perhaps also, as a matter of fact, starting from 1980 when the country gained independence. And I think Sam already alluded to some of what happened immediately following the achievement of or the attainment of independence in 1980. The first was the civil disturbances that occurred in the country's western and central provinces of the Midlands and Matabeleland around about 1983, just after independence, 3 or so years after independence, when the state-sponsored a state-sponsored military brigade, which was known as the 5th Brigade, was sent into rural Midlands and Matabeleland to flush out what were then referred to as dissidents, who were mostly former Zebra guerrillas, one of the liberation war armies that was led by the late Joshua Nkomo, who were accused of attempting to stage an insurrection and unseat Robert Mugabe's newly inaugurated post-independence government. So the disturbances in the Midlands and the Matabeleland provinces led to the deaths and displacement of over 10,000 civilians by some estimates. Some of the more outrageous estimates actually put the number at 20,000. So the number of people who were actually displaced and died during the Gukurahundi disturbances, as it became known, is a contested number, but it ranges from anything between 3,000 to about 10,000, which by any stretch of the imagination is a very, very large number of people to die in a context in which the country is not fighting a foreign adversary. So the second was the political and economic crisis, which Sam also spoke about, which began around 1988 and only began to slow down in 2009 following the establishment of a SADC-brokered unity government. The crisis was first occasioned in 1997 when the state under Robert Mugabe, the late Robert Mugabe, resolved to give out unbudgeted payouts under duress. There was an element of arm twisting to the whole thing when the country's former freedom fighters demanded to be paid gratuities for their participation in the country's liberation war. And these were unbudgeted payouts, and they led to the spectacular collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar in November of the same year. And later, the second cause to the crisis was the decision by the ZANU-PF government led by Robert Mugabe to expropriate white-owned farmland without compensation and give it out to landless blacks at the beginning of the year 2000. So what emerged in this period was essentially a recourse by the post-colonial state, the ZANU-PF-led post-colonial state, to create a very exclusive approach to the whole notion of patriotism, because these two acts, the payouts of 1997 and the expropriation of white-owned farms, led to a very rapid acceleration in terms of opposition to the ZANU-PF government. And in reaction, the government responded by creating a very exclusivist narrative that sort of privatized the state almost into something of a ZANU-PF-owned entity, to the extent that ZANU-PF had fought and won the liberation war. And in the same vein, or in the same breath, labeled opposition politics, whites, and people of mixed race as sellouts and lakeys of the West. So all these came together, then begin to create very fertile ground for the cultivation of new forms of representation in the theater, which tended to question and revolt against this very narrow conception of the state and what it meant to be a patriot and Zimbabwean. So it is against this overarching framework that in their chapter, Moyo and Mpofu look at, or rather focus on what it means to be a subaltern and hail from Matabeleland. And they write a chapter which they entitle Popular Theatre as a Struggle for Identity and Representation in Matabeleland from 1970 to the present. So in this chapter, they view popular theatre, including real life performance at football matches, as well as musical shows in this marginalized part of the country, as channels that were used for political mobilization and resistance against state hegemonic forces, which the people of Matabeleland felt somehow marginalized people from the western part of the country who happened to be mainly of Ndebele ethnic origin. So in two other chapters by Joy Rolson and Kelvin Chikonzo, entitled respectively, Harnessing the Whirlwind, Hybridity, Memory and Crisis in Theatre During Zimbabwe's Operation Mrambatsina, and also Towards Democratic Protest Theatre in Zimbabwe, Vittori Productions, Protest Revolutionaries. What the two contributors do is they devote attention to the practice of political protest theatre in the context of the hyperinflationary era of 2000 to 2008, and they identify three classes of anti-state intellectual theatre artists who they believe became very active in terms of resisting the hegemonic forces of the ZANU-PF government after the year 2000. And they delineate these three classes of intellectuals as what they refer to as, or rather what Chikonzo refers to as state intellectuals, and as on the one hand, anti-state intellectuals on the other, and organic intellectuals last but not necessarily least. I will not, of course, go into detail in terms of defining what each one of these represented, but all this is very eloquently in the chapters themselves. So one key point that Chikonzo makes is that ultimately makes the point that if left unchecked, protest theatre can very easily erode the democracy that it purports to fight for by performing discourses of anti-state intellectuals, while in fact negating the discourse of other social classes who in any case tend to bear the brunt of some of the injustices that come with post-colonial states which become repressive towards their own citizens. So he sees anti-state intellectuals who became very active in protest theatre as people who were largely pushing their own agendas to the total negation of the agendas and the discourses that may have appealed to the people whom they claimed to be speaking on behalf of. And then Chikonzo's chapter is followed by that by Rolson, in which she relies on Marvin Carlson's twin concepts of haunting and ghosting, which she couples together with James Scott's notion of hidden transcripts. And she focuses on theatre that was produced during Operation Mrambatsina, when the ZANU-PF government went on an orgy of destroying unregistered businesses and unplanned settlements, leading to the displacement of over 700,000 of the country's citizens across different towns and cities sometime in 2005. So Rolson labels the theatre that arose during the just after Operation Mrambatsina, which translates to English as Operation Restore Order, or Get Rid of the Trash. She sees the kind of theatre that arose during that time or immediately after that experience as panic theatre. And she says that when you read this panic theatre and analyze it against James Scott's notion of hidden transcripts, what comes across is that theatre by the marginalized became a form of satire that was used to satirize and bring to question the tyrannical tendencies of the post-colonial state, especially following the displacement of nearly 1 million people in a context that was outside of a war. So the collection then ends with a chapter by Maedza, who offers a very fascinating interrogation of common approaches or pedestrian approaches to the whole notion of what we normally refer to as indigenous identities, or the notion of indigeneity in post-colonial context. His chapter seems to decry what he views as a tendency in post-independence states to reify what he refers to as pre-contact identities. And I think what Maeda does is that he frames the whole notion of indigenous identities as it is often propagated in post-independent states from the perspective of cultural nationalisms, when newly independent states usually become so proud of their cultural and ethnic identities to a point where they then fall into the pitfall of actually reifying the indigenous identities to mean pre-contact identities or identities before contact with the West. So this chapter is based on the establishment of a dance troupe at Great Zimbabwe University, which was established a few years after the year 2000. And he is concerned that when this dance troupe was established at Great Zimbabwe University, it actually fell into the pit of propagating pre-contact identities in ways that he felt tended to portray these indigenous pre-contact African identities as largely fixed and immutable, without taking into account aspects of hybridity and cultural contact and change, which usually come about as a result of the post-colonial experience. So he says that when societies adopt this very, very ahistorical approach to what is indigenous, then they can very easily play into the hands of colonialist divisions, which are often quite pejorative by their nature. And then they begin to conceptualize Africans as people who are time-trapped in terms of their culture and traditions. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I think both Sam and I have tried to provide a fairly compendious but detailed insight into what the book is all about in terms of its focus on aspects of identity, hegemony, and representation within a post-colonial setup. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for listening to our presenters. Thank you, Professor Samuel Ravengai. Thank you, Professor Owen Seda. Thanks for those wonderful presentations. And I'm really excited about the book. And I think it's a great contribution to African theater scholarship. And looking forward to having a copy in my hands pretty soon. Okay, I'm going to open it straight to questions from our audience. I know that we've had people who have been making notes, and I think that we've got one question in the chat. So our chair, Dr. Tosin Tume, is having problems with her internet. So I'm going to do my best to chair the Q&A session. And if she can join us, and then she can carry on. But just to start off, we have a question from, pardon me if I don't pronounce the name correctly, please, Refioli Lepere. He says, thank you for the presentation and the book, and looking forward to the book. I'm wondering how language came into play in relation to the cultural identity and representations in theater and productions. What is the role, so I think that's the second question, what is the role of language in the urgency of telling stories in post-colonial theater in an attempt to preserve and document narratives and decolonize theater practice? And there is a specific question here for Professor Seda. It says, Professor Seda, you say the marginalized use theater to disrupt the dominate. How does it work in the conception of their own identities and even nation formation? Does the book touch on ideas of language in the creation and representations? So I don't know if you captured all that, or should we just take it one at a time? So there are a couple of questions in there. Samuel, you're muted, by the way. So, over to you.
Well, I wondered if Prof. Seda wanted to engage with a question specifically directed to him on marginalized, but maybe since you pinpoint me, I'm going to go on the spot. I'm wondering how language came into play in relation to cultural identities and representation in theaters and productions. What is the role of language in the agency of telling stories in post-colonial theater in an attempt to preserve and document narratives and decolonize theater? Well, thank you, Refile. That's a very interesting question. To my knowledge, there is no chapter that specifically deals with language in the manner in which we understand language as the oral spoken medium of communication. However, what I seem to understand from the chapters is that African theater is proposing a different language of African theater, which resides in visual dramaturgy around the body. And according to Chivandikwa and the other co-writer, supported by costume, dance, music, song. So that dimension is what the African kind of language is trying to be advanced by the various scholars that write about it. We had certain chapters that went beyond the size that was allowed by the publishers, and they to be left out. And I'm assuming that had we been given that permission, the notion of language would have been a very important one. In a different edition or in a different kind of research, I touch on language a lot, particularly on how language can become the site of resistance. While I'm not speaking about the book, I may speak briefly about that. It has to do with the Africanization of English words, for instance, number one. Number two, the creation of new languages, such as in Pidgin English in Nigeria, Tsotsital in South Africa, Shilapalapa or Slapalapa in Zimbabwe, which some people say Fanakalo, and so on, including Afrikaans for that matter. These are all languages that were created in order to respond to the environment, and which are then used in theater. And when one is analyzing African theater, you see those particular mediums of communication as sites of struggle. If you go to my PhD, which is for free online, it has a separate, very detailed chapter on that aspect, which unfortunately the book is was unable to deal with due to space restrictions. Owen, did I handle that accurately?
Yes, thank you very much. Through you, Chair, if I may go ahead.
Go ahead, there's a bit of feedback.
Yeah, there seems to be feedback.
Okay, go ahead. I think it might be, yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Sam. Yes, Prof. Sam has made the point that not a single one of the chapters in the book focuses on language in the sense of languages, the different languages that people speak depending on their national or ethnic identities. But what it certainly does is that it frames all the discussion that is framed in the book is framed against the language of the theater, whether the theater is taking place in an African language, either Shona or Ndebele or English, but the issues that it discusses focus on all language theater as practiced in Zimbabwe during the time frame that the book focuses on. But I would also like to make the point that previously other Zimbabwean scholars who have written on the issue of language in the Zimbabwean context, the use of language in the context of Zimbabwean theater, they've talked about how some of the most profound plays that the country has produced are those that have been produced in what Chivandikwa has referred to previously as the Ndenglishing and the Shonglishing of the stage, by which he means the use of an English idiom that is informed by inflections of both the Shona and the Ndebele languages as the dominant languages spoken in the country. That's what I would say. That's what I would want to say about language in terms of our non-focus on it as a concept in the book itself. And I think Prof. Sam also did mention that the book originally was supposed to be about 13 or so chapters, but because of the limits of our publishers, we could not do any more than what is captured now. And then to go to the question of how the marginalized used or attempted to use theater in terms of conceptualizing their own identities, what seems to have happened right from the beginning of the attempt at dominance by what Sam earlier on referred to as Rhodesian discourse was that those who existed at the margin tended to say, look, the representations that seem to be the hegemonic ones, the hegemonically propagated representations are not who we are. And there was always an attempt to try to propagate a different identity from the margins, which, as Sam also said earlier on in his summary, is precisely what Julius Heinecke writes in his chapter when he talks about the work that began to occur at rooftop promotions as a theater in the park, and also at Amakosi Theatre's Township Square Cultural Center, and indeed many other venues which we do not necessarily mention in our outline. So it was a case of those at the margin refusing to be kept at the margin, but transgressing the hegemonic forces and establishing and adopting their own spaces in which they wrote counter narratives to the dominance of the state. That's what I would want to say in answer.
Thank you for those very full answers from both of you. We've got a couple of other comments. I think it's just a hello from Professor Duroni from University of Lagos, from Professor Charles Nwadigwe, also from Nigeria. He says, I would like to know the direction of the dominant theater constructions in the post-Mugabe era of Zimbabwe. I think you've kind of talked about this at the beginning in terms of the limits of the book project, but I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that kind of post-Mugabe era.
Sam, you can go first.
Well, very interesting. I think that question is very interesting. I think each period creates its own kind of theater, and what we seem to get now, post-Mugabe, plays about him that he wouldn't allow during his lifetime. For instance, just after he was deposed, there was a new play, I think that was done at Rooftop Promotions, Devs Guzagier, he can confirm, which was called Operation Restore Order, Operation Restore Legacy. Legacy is the pronunciation of the Army General in his English that he uses for all L's, he uses R. So it was a way of mocking the way he articulates his syllables and consonants. And it was really about the last days of Mugabe. Those kinds of performances were not permitted. And now the theater makers are revisiting that history in new ways, so that they infuse their own perspective or their own understanding of that particular situation. My understanding is also that even filmmakers are also harvesting stories in that period, which could not be allowed during the time that he was surviving. Actually, there's one film now on Robert Mugabe that is on circulation. I also understand that people are revisiting history even before Mugabe by going into the spirit mediums that championed the first Chimurenga or first uprising or first liberation war in the 1890s. I think there's now a new film on Nehanda, which is the statue that has dominated the headlines on the Harare landscape and so on. I also do understand that comedians are also coming into the fold. There's one comedian called Dr. Vikela, who is satirizing the current sitting president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, by saying whatever he wants under the guise of theater. So I think there is a certain level of tolerance and revisiting of history in order to project new perspectives that could not be tolerated in the past dispensation. However, I need to point out this. I have not seen any significant shift in terms of aesthetics. The aesthetic is still the same, but the themes that are being pursued are the ones that tend to revise, question, and also comment on what was happening in the past, which the previous dispensation could not permit. Professor Seda, you can assist me here in terms of your understanding of the dominant theater trends in Zimbabwe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sam. I would only want to add by saying that what seems to have happened post, and perhaps let me just say, I tend to be corrected here, post 2015 or so, there's been a dominance now of social media platforms as popular forms of cultural propagation to satirize the so-called new dispensation. I'm not, having been away from Zimbabwe for quite some time now, I'm not sure just how much work is still going on at Theatre in the Park as well as Amakosi, but I know very well that on internet social media platforms such as YouTube as well as the other platforms, there's a lot of work by Bus Stop TV, the Comic Past, and so on and so forth, which satirizes the new dispensation through performance.
Okay, thank you again.
I think this actually reaches out to a lot more people than the theaters were able to attract during their time.
Thank you, Owen and Samuel. We've got a couple more questions. We're kind of nearing the end of our time this evening. Just to say to everyone that this event is streaming live onto the African Theatre Association YouTube page. I've put the link in the chat there, so you can always rewatch it or share it with your students and colleagues. But we've got a couple of questions. We got one from Mary Helen Kutsi, which says, good evening, colleagues. Thanks for your very interesting presentation. I may have missed it, but does any part of the book deal with the ways in which theater might be used to look at the decolonization in terms of the somatic and kinesthetic impact of varied modes of colonization, in particular with reference to women and women's bodies? I know you talked about, I think somewhere you talked about Afro-sinology and training the post-colonial actors. So I don't know if you want to start from that perspective. You muted.
Thank you. Yes, the overarching argument around the issue of the body is that African theatre is proposing a slightly different way of projecting its themes to those who love theatre. And one of the key characteristics of that aesthetic is the body. And the body that is endowed with extraneous stuff that will support it, as the case of Chivandikwa's chapter on devising and so on. Now, as it relates to, so I think that in itself answers the question on decolonization in terms of somatic and kinesthetic impact of varied modes of colonization. Now, in respect to, or with reference to women and women's bodies, does your section deal with that, Owen?
No, not at all. In fact, I was going to say, thanks, perhaps you've preempted what I was going to say in my response, Sam. What I would say to Marilyn is that perhaps the whole reference to women or focus on women and women's bodies in particular actually opens a new vistas for a dedicated research that could actually perhaps look at not just one country, but perhaps Southern Africa from a comparative perspective. I think this is very interesting indeed. But I can say with certainty that our book does not, in any single chapter, necessarily focus on women and the performed body in terms of women as a direct focus.
Thank you for those very frank answers. I think what that question is hinting is that there's some work to be done around about that area in African theatre discourse, and it's certainly something that we need more of our researchers to pick up the work, because there's quite a lot of practice work going on in that area as well. The next question kind of talks about this, so I don't know if you want to come back to it. It's from Linda Zikubu, which talks, as a theatre practitioner, scholar, and performer, I have experienced the differences in how my body responds to the embodiment of English and the embodiment of isiZulu, which brings forth distinct and unique embodied experiences. I think there needs to be a theory of the African body. And there is that theory that Sam Ravengai is developing. And he talked about it at the beginning, the Afro-sinology. And I know he's done some really key research on post-colonial actor work as well. But before we take the last question, and you're welcome to respond to that a bit more somewhere in a minute.
Yeah.
We've got one more question. I think we'll wrap it up there. But just to read a few other comments from our audience. Congratulations to Professor Seda and Ravengai. Thank you for this much needed publication. Can't wait to purchase my copy. And that's from Muyaradi Chito Kobo. And also we have from Mary Helen, I think, saying thank you, looking forward to reading. Javier Pinon says, thanks for the presentations and contribution. The final chapter of the book seems particularly important, even in a wider context as Zimbabwe. But the last question, just to say, is from Nadia Awa. Nadia is a member of AfTA from Pakistan, from Lahore. He says, very interesting talk. I would like to know whether colonization, dominance, or hegemony is only seen in the book with respect to post-colonial formulations, or has it been taken beyond to touch para-colonial aspects of state failures that have less to do with the history of colonization, but more with individual failures? So if you address that question, then we can round up, please.
All right, I'm going to begin with the comment from Linda Sikubu about embodiment and about a theory of the African body. Yes, my theory of African sinology is now in the public domain. I think it comes from a paper that I delivered in France and at the artistic research workshop at Witwatersrand, which is now online for free. It is entitled Artistic Research with specific reference to Zimbabwe and South Africa. And there I make the point that theory comes from practice, and then that theory comes back to guide practice. I then make the point that Africans have been dancing, acting, singing, creating theater, which is all performance, since time immemorial. What is the theory that we can derive from that? I make the important observation that when a body is groomed in a particular socio-political context, it absorbs all the rhythms of the environment. For instance, if you grow up in the rural areas of Zimbabwe, all the rituals of rites of passage, if you go to churches, singing, dancing, rituals of cattle herding, goats, and the songs and all those kinds of things, they leave an imprint in the body, which I call embodiment. And I'm not saying that this particular quality of the body is inherent to only Africans. If you bring any other body from any other, social polity into that context, the body will be able to absorb those kinds of rhythms and have a certain kind of embodiment, which the body does not eject or jettison at the moment of joining the academy. So that performer who comes to Wits or Pretoria or whatever, or Middlesex or whatever the case may be, will still have those kinds of embodiments that come from that kind of training as one grows up. And this is what needs to be said, to be nurtured by the academy instead of considering that as useless. So the concept of Afro-sinology is harvesting the skills and the talents and all the abilities that are embedded in the body, in the making of theater. And this is why I then make the point that the body is the most critical tool in African performance in the context of Afro-sinology. So yes, there's already a theory. If you want to mobilize around it or agree or disagree with me, that's okay, but that's what I'm advancing at this particular moment. And perhaps in the next year or two, this will be in a much bigger platform, such as a book or a series of journal articles that speak to that concept. Should I stop here before I address the other thing, Owen?
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Owen, I think he's passed the mic to you.
Hello?
Owen, I think Prof. Sam is inviting you to respond if you want to respond to that particular question.
Okay. Yes, I was going to respond partly. I hope I'm touching on the essence of what Nadia is actually asked in the chat bubble. She's talking about whether the book, in fact, only refers to issues of dominance and hegemony, only in terms of post-colonial formulations, or it also takes into account para-colonial aspects of state failure, such as that have less to do with the history of colonization, but more with individual failure. I think everything is subsumed to the extent that the post-colonial state fails. The extent to which the post-colonial state fails, I think, is also a function of the extent to which the individual hegemonic forces that drive the post-colonial state also fail at an individual level. So to that extent, I think if you look at the way in which Robert Mugabe became this very, very larger than life epic figure and leader of the Zimbabwean revolution in the post-colonial, both in the colonial and post-colonial state, it became a function of his own failure as an individual, which then which also then subsequently had an imprint on the extent to which the post-colonial state failed in that respect. So I think the two speak to one another. If the individuals who drive the post-colonial state fail to realize their personal limitations at the individual level, then they write that on the state, which also fails in sympathy. That's what I would say. I don't know whether it makes sense.
Thank you so much for that. I think we're going to draw the curtains here, but Samuel, you were going to come back quickly to the last point.
Well, exactly as Owen has just raised. In fact, what the collaborators or the contributing authors have called panic theater, and what the other contributor is called a protest theater, it is all panic theater against the post-colonial state because of its failures. It is all protest theater because of the failures of the post-colonial state. So if you want a single answer, does the book address that? Yes, particularly in the second part where it speaks to the excesses of the post-colonial state and how theater is intervening or commenting on those kinds of issues. Actually, even if we go back to part one, around the 7th chapter by Julius Henneke, who talks about theater as a public sphere. So the two theater spaces, Amakosi and Rooftop Promotions, were specifically designed during the crisis period, which we have termed or we have delineated as 1998 and 2008, as spaces that were used by oppositional forces to articulate issues that newspapers or films or any other medium could not do. But those spaces were able to speak back to the excesses of the post-colonial state. That's what I would slightly add to what Owen said. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Owen Seda and Professor Samuel Ravengai. Thank you so much for bringing this new developments in African theater to us, and we look forward to the actual physical book next month. And we know there's a lot of research that underpins that book, and you've talked about some of them already. We look forward to, some research collaboration perhaps amongst members and other African theatre practitioners and scholars around the globe as well. Can I say a big thank you? If you all our audience, if you want to join me to say thank you again to Professor Samuel, Ravengai, and Professor Owen Seda, and thank you to yourselves for being here throughout this meeting, for joining us and being a part of this meeting. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you continue to keep safe and keep well. Before we go, very final point, I just want to share, I shared this at the beginning, but just want to share it again very quickly, just to let you know that we have the African Theatre Association conference coming up in about 2 weeks' time. That's at from 14th to 16th of July 2021. It's being hosted by Humboldt University in Berlin. And our two keynote speakers, as you can see, is Associate Professor Evan Hutchinson, Professor Samuel Kasule. If you haven't already paid your AfTA membership fee, please go on our website, africantheatreassociation.org, and you'll see the link to pay there, because that's the only way. We're not charging registration fee this year, but when you pay your membership, then you will be sent joining instructions. So thank you once again, everyone, and thank you to our speakers. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.